So I know that we're both IES alum. Now you were Paris 91?
Yeah, I guess I was. Seems like a long time ago.
Yeah, okay, and I was Dublin 15, which still seems like a long time ago.
Well, just to compare, I used to write a column for my college newspaper, and I kept doing it when I was over there, and I faxed it over.
Wow.
So, just so you know.
And that was during the internship, or that was just in the general vicinity?
Well, we didn't really do an internship. It was, when I was studying there, I continued my column. I wrote about what it was like to be an American in Paris, and I just faxed it over to my editors.
So now, what were you studying at school that you already knew that you wanted to be a writer?
Oh, I definitely didn't know that I wanted to be a writer. It was just something I did. I didn't really even become a writer till I was like 29. So I studied political science.
Wow. And so how did you kind of fall into writing?
I had a master's degree in public policy, and a couple years after that I was working for the New York City government. And a friend of mine, I was complaining to a friend about my job, and she said, hey, a friend of mine from grad school, and she said, hey, you used to be a pretty good writer back in school, right? Why don't you give that a shot? Why don't you take a class? And so I took a class with a very now famous teacher of writing who has launched many, many New York careers, Sue Shapiro. So in a way, I'm one of like a million people who she helped change careers into writing.
Wow. And kind of just going back to Paris, did you always knew that you wanted to travel, or did that kind of develop while you were studying?
I come from a traveling family, so once I hit like 10 or 11 years old and my parents thought I would appreciate it, we went somewhere every summer, far or near. But I know that my mother always wanted to study in France, and I don't think either of my parents ever lived abroad, so they were very encouraging about trying to go there, and it was certainly the first time I ever lived in another country.
And are there any like specific memories from that time that still have stuck with you?
I certainly remember very clearly. I took 2 courses in the French university with French students, and I just remember in one of them it was the history of the Roman Empire, or the history of, I don't know, something like that. Mm-hmm. And I remember the professor giving out grades, and the way he gave out the grades was so different from Americans. He would literally like give a speech and say the person's grade out loud to everybody. And the speech would come before the grade. So you'd hear him say like, oh, well, this was flawed, that was flawed, this was flawed, but really good, A+. And it was very dramatic. It was like a performance. And of course, in the U.S., even if they're going to post the grades, they do it probably with a code name next to it or whatever. Or I guess you get it online now, right? I don't know. I have no idea. But there was that. I also remember very clearly that I would watch certain sort of American-like shows in French when I was living with the family in Paris. And one of them was the French version of Family Feud. And I got this idea that we should like go to the studio and sit in the studio audience. And I brought it actually to the director of the program in Paris, and she totally bought in, and she figured it out, and we all went, like 20 of us went and sat in the audience of the French so Family Feud. And then they kind of knew we were coming, so we got to go up on stage and like pose with the little buzzer thing.
Oh my God.
Family Feud.
Yeah.
And then it's interesting that my French family, my mom and dad, so to speak, they were just very intrigued by why I would they were very proper French people. They were very intrigued why I would be watching this and why I would ever go to the studio audience. And then the host, whose name was Patrick Roy, he actually ended up dying very young, like in his 40s, like a couple years after I was in France. And my French mom clipped the obituary and mailed it to me.
What?
She thought I would be like grief-stricken. A couple years.
That's so cute, though.
It was very cute.
But she was thinking of you.
Yeah, we stayed in touch for quite a while.
Wow.
What else do you want to know?
Yeah, so I guess for people who are thinking about studying abroad, what would be the main reason that you would tell them that they should do it, besides possibly being on the French Family Feud, which is a big one?
That is big. Well, I think it's everyone, for people who love to travel and are interested in other cultures or think they love to travel and have never done it, it's basically free travel. I mean, it's not free money-wise, but you have time. You're going to be in college anyway. So you go spend that time and live in a foreign country. I mean, after college, maybe you take a year off after college, but besides that, you're done. Unless you can figure out a way to move to another country and work, this is like the easiest way to live in a foreign culture, which is something that most of us never get the chance to do. So I wish I'd done it for a year, frankly, because then after that, I finally was able to live abroad again when I was 38. I moved to Brazil as a reporter. So, better do it now.
Yeah, that's a lot of time.
And also, just for language purposes, the younger you are when you actually really become fluent in a language, the better. So that's another thing. Also, when are you ever going to become, even if you take the language in school, chances are you're not really fluent in it. So why would you take a language? By the time people are in college, they may have taken French or Spanish or Chinese or whatever for like 8 years. Why would you do that and never live in the place if you had the chance to go there?
And what about, I guess, just alums who are traveling? Do you have any travel tips that they should know just to kind of make the most of their time?
I mean, I got a lot of travel tips. That's my whole life is giving travel tips. I don't know. I think probably a number one tip would be be sure you leave some time in the trip for just wandering around wherever you are, or if you're driving, just sort of extra time that if you see something at the side of the road or you see a sign to a little town, you're able to take off. A lot of people these days plan like every day, not down to the minute, but certainly almost down to the hour. And they say, oh my God, if we're only going to have a week in wherever, Spain, in Madrid, then we better go to all of these things. And the only way we're going to fit them in is to schedule it really far in advance. And I think that they're basically missing the point of travel. And I just encourage people to take at least a day and don't plan anything and just ask around what to do or just wander around a neighborhood or something like that. You don't have to be totally free and not make any plans, but you really just have to be ready to be spontaneous and realize that one thing whenever I ask people what's your best ever travel story, what's the greatest thing that ever happened to you when you traveled, it's literally never when they planned out a day very carefully and everything went exactly as planned.
Yeah, true.
And so my question is, why do you do that? If your best days happen when things go awry, why not just not even plan that much in the first place and let those things happen? And what I found over writing a travel column for 5 years, I really had the need for my column to tell stories. I couldn't just go to a place and say, oh, this hotel is pretty good. I mean, TripAdvisor does that for you. I needed stories. I needed things to happen that were interesting. And I really felt that really came by not sticking to plans rather than sticking to plans. But I now have a YouTube channel called Globally Curious, in which I talk about exactly this kind of stuff. So it's just on YouTube. You just have to search for it.
Okay, and that kind of, also another plug, your book, isn't that kind of talking about that premise of being able to stray from the itinerary that you have set?
That's right. It's actually, the book and the YouTube channel are quite connected. I basically, if this stuff is interesting, I talk about this all in my book called Rediscovering Travel, a guide for the globally curious. And I also talk about it on a YouTube channel also called Globally Curious. So it's basically if you hear me talk, what I wrote is basically this exact kind of stuff, except it goes on for 250 pages. So, I mean, the thing is, people don't really talk about travel. They talk about where they travel to, but no one sits around and is like, well, let's see, how should I travel? What are the techniques? We do that for lots of other stuff. You don't play the piano you don't talk about, you don't talk about the great time you played chopsticks or whatever. That's not how you teach it. You teach it by actually being practical. We just don't think of travel as a learnable skill like that. But once you do it for 5 years, you start figuring out and you start watching and seeing what people do wrong. Not that I do everything right, but far from it. In fact, I make mistakes all the time, and that's actually part of what you learn. Mistakes are just a part of traveling. In fact, if you don't make any mistakes, you're probably not doing anything very interesting.
Yeah.
Of course, there are some people who need to take these very guided tours. They might have health problems. They may have never been out of the country before. They might be terrified, whatever. But otherwise, you gotta maintain a little bit of independence, even if you're going with a travel. Even if someone's planning your trip for you, and some of the stuff is with a group, just be ready to flee at any moment from that group whenever you can.
And do you kind of think that people losing their sense of spontaneity while traveling is in part from technology, because we're able to kind of check TripAdvisor and see exactly what we should do?
My only thought is whether to say it's 99% because of that or 100% because of that.
Okay.
Not that people have always, like, there's always been people who haven't been spontaneous. You take a group trip or whatever, but now it's all on your phone, or in most places you can get on your phone around the world. And if you walk by a restaurant, you can be like, oh, let's go in here. But wait, no, let's not go in here yet. Let's check it out on TripAdvisor.
Yeah.
And then you read all this stuff, you hear about all the dishes that are there, and then you go in and you just order what you read about on TripAdvisor, and half the time it's not as good as it was on TripAdvisor, and you're disappointed. Whereas if you just walked in the restaurant and it was like a pretty good place, you'd be happy. You wouldn't be comparing it with all these reviews on TripAdvisor. It's not that you shouldn't use TripAdvisor for certain things, but certainly, once you're out and about somewhere, just do stuff. I mean, come on.
And I'm sure you have so many exciting trips on the horizon, but is there one specifically that you're looking forward to?
I don't have all that many trips on the horizon. I mostly am going to Latin America these days. I'm mostly going to Brazil, but I am about to go to the Pacific coast of Colombia. One thing I always do is I look for places. I think I speak for many tourists when I say I hate tourists, right? I mean, it's ironic, but I don't really want to go to a place with a ton of tourists. It can be fun in a certain way. Paris basically is a place for travelers, for, part of the experience. Like Paris without tourists isn't even Paris. But a lot of times I like to go, I'd rather be at a place where there's, very, very few tourists. So I found this city in Colombia on the Pacific coast. It's called Buenaventura. About 4 years ago was definitely too dangerous to visit. Colombia little by little is becoming safe to visit. And a very good friend of mine who lives down there said it's now one of her favorite cities. And it's, as long as you're careful now, you don't go anywhere where, you haven't been told is okay. Says it's perfectly fine for tourists. They have great seafood. And there's also a really deep sort of Pacific Colombian culture, which most people don't know about, because most of Colombian culture that we get comes from either, the Caribbean coast or Medellin and that area, or inland, or even the Amazon. So it's sort of a unique part of Colombia that I'm looking forward to seeing.
Awesome. All right. Well, thank you so much for talking with me.
You are welcome.